Thank you, Gabriel, for finding time for this interview. The reason why we decided to make it is a will to support and maybe extend the consequences of your statement, whatever they are, we don't know yet. There is a true psychoanalytic gesture to create a frame in which the one who produces discourse, or the one who is being produced by discourse, to be more precise, would make this paradox turn and try to see the place of their own speech. So it's absolutely logical that the same operation has to be applied to a collective speaker, which is what the community actually is. So you kind of reinvented this frame, and afterwards it seems, and it is absolutely necessary and unavoidable. And now psychoanalyst communities have to be concerned about their own ideology. If they don't, so much the worse for them. So in this interview, I'd like to focus on institutional topic, which is quite disturbing, especially in a post-Soviet space, where we haven't yet had a more or less strong psychoanalytic community. Like Lacanians don't even know what Lacanian organizations exist in the world. They only, know that France is so painfully far away, like this periphery complex. And that's kind of funny that a lot of analysts in Russia and Ukraine, fortunately not all of them, with whom I discussed your book, somehow decided that your position is just anti-Millerian, and even more that it's anti-institutional in general and anti-Lacanian. And at first, while reading your book, I noticed that several times in the beginning you say, like, guys, please don't think that I'm against institutions. And it wasn't clear why would you even articulate this obvious fact that you're not against institutions. But then I remembered how Freud used to make excuses for his ideas, and exactly at those points he used to be attacked. So I was like, well, here we go. Like, probably you kind of inherited the configuration of Freud's desire at this point. So my first question is, how do readers in different countries perceive your work? Are there any specifics, or you didn't notice anything like that?
Yes, I think that there are definitely specifics. And I'm actually very curious to hear more about the specifics of what you were saying, because I agree that it's not a good idea to treat, the existence of psychoanalysis as being similar everywhere. I think it's very, very differentiated per region. I think that the reception of the book has shown this to some degree. But I think I also have a very small sample. Brazil is definitely the place I have more to say about, because I'm not just promoting the book, but I'm doing most of my political work and political organizing in Brazil, so I got a chance to see much more of the reaction. But I'd say that there are some things I can say more generally. The first is that by far there has been a division between those who really don't care about the book and those who find it at least interesting and want to talk about it, between well-established analysts or psychoanalyst theorists in universities and so on. They're generally not very interested. I don't think I've been invited to one talk in a university or had like serious engagements with practically no Lacanians specifically, who are already have a good clinic, are well established institutionally. Generally, they didn't really care. Mostly people who are either starting their training as analysts, or who feel they are part of some type of more marginal process. I feel they have been the ones to be more interested in what the book is talking about. So there's definitely been a division in that sense. And I don't know, 80% of the activities I've participated were like students, analysts in training, small psychoanalysis collectives, you know, people who just contacted me online and said, I want to talk about it, but much more like that than through like the proper academic institutional channels. That's by far a big division. Secondly, and I think that even the publication of the book in English already shows this. The book was published by now in English, Russian, Spanish, and Portuguese. And even the interest of having the book published in Russian, I think already speaks to this. In Spanish, it wasn't published in Argentina, for example, where it is, where we have most of the Lacanians in the world. They're there right now. It was published in Chile, which is a much smaller country, which have kind of a less established Lacanian community. And when the book came out in English, kind of that also happens. It didn't really interest kind of in any serious, substantial way the community of English-speaking or native English-speaking philosophers and psychoanalysts. It just served as a gateway to get to people in Lebanon, for example, where suddenly I had a really good relationship with them there, or to get the book to my friends who eventually translated it to Russian. So in English, the book was the language served as just a gateway to get to other communities, but didn't really seem to interest that much Americans or British or whatever. And I feel like that other division is also very prevalent between those who feel like they're more established, they're more committed, I think, to the idea that psychoanalysis is this revolutionary thing, subversive thing that they already have, and it's a practice that is, you know, it's kind of sorted out. Now we just need to show it to other people and show how good it is. Those people weren't very interested in the book. And in Brazil, this definitely was also the case. This division also holds here. You can see that very clearly. So I do feel like there is something interesting to discuss about this kind of the social or historical conditions under which this debate is meaningful. I have the impression that it has two characteristics. One is you need to have some access to these analytic debates already, so some connection to the already existing psychoanalytic culture, but on the other hand, a degree of precarity, instability, that the horizon that this community promises is no longer viable. So I feel like where those two things are, you have those two things, you get some, that discussion is already happening. You didn't even have to wait for the book, of course. People were already wondering, like, okay, great, psychoanalysis is amazing, but like, I'm not going to be able to work as a psychoanalyst. You know, some of the amazing things we're saying psychoanalysis does, they're not managing to do it here. I'm seeing the extreme right rise to power, and I don't see any connection between all the critiques and these political developments, things like this. So I think there are certain social conditions that made the book more relevant than others, I guess. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, just as a...
Let's see what will happen after translation to French.
Yeah, that would be interesting if somebody translated it to French. Yeah.
Actually, I saw quite a lot of interviews in English. There is this very cool channel of Daniel Tatt, with whom you made also interviews and discussions. And in one of interviews, I guess with him, you said that the idea of applying Lacanian knowledge to organization of the group and group process is something you started with when you decided to organize a Lacanian study group in accordance with the Lacanian theory, and then it grew to a whole project. If I got it right, it's the group you mentioned in your last article about the past. So can you say something about it, and what are the key principles or tools you use in group organizations?
Yeah, actually, it's funny because when I was doing my master's, I think, because I studied, like I was a very kind of, how do you say this, a card-carrying Zizek person. Like I studied his work a lot. I did my master's and doctorate on his work in many sense. And so I was very into the idea that psychoanalysis could really help with political practice. So when I started getting more organized, this is like 15 years ago, I don't know, oh my God, 10, 15 years ago, when I started getting more organized politically, that was what I had in mind, that somehow psychoanalysis would help me with the things I had to deal in practice. And I think that was the first shock, to learn that there was very little in the work of theorists that I admired a lot, including Lacan himself, who had so much to say about what politics is, the discourse of this, the discourse of that. Very little was useful for everyday political practice. Like there wasn't anything on this. So there was a lot of, so that was the first thing. I realized that there was a difference between the use of Lacanian concepts in political theory for the sake of explaining how society works, talking about ideology, talking about enjoyment and capitalism, this and that, and like a total silence over, okay, but then what's useful of this theory for political practice? So that was a first kind of surprise that I had. But my idea for many years was then, well, let's develop this. Let's find out what is the use of analytic categories in these contexts of collective organization. But what happens is that when you do things collectively, the concepts that are in your head don't matter very much, because you need to find out what works for the group, what works for everyone, what's relevant for everyone, not for yourself. So you kind of naturally stop using your own categories and you start adopting the categories that work for those collectives. And rarely those were the analytic ones. And more I realized that, you know, Marxist, communist political tradition has a lot of tools to discuss what happens within organizations, how to deal with these things. I think that psychoanalysis gave me, especially once I started with the clinic, it gave me a good sensibility of how to, let's say, not forget that there's all these things happening with people when they're working together, right? But it didn't really give me solutions or kind of clear ideas on how to negotiate with these things. And at no point did the idea that, you know, the unconscious is political, or the discourse of university, or any of these things help me at all in political practice. So I started dropping this idea more and more, and started to realize that it's not so much that you can use psychoanalysis in political life, but that probably the inverse was a better approach, that there is very likely a political history behind most of the good things about psychoanalysis. Meaning, psychoanalysis is a small island, and the history of political struggle is a very big ocean. Like, which one is ultimately going to explain which? Thousands and millions of people struggling for a better world for 5,000 years, or 10 French guys in Paris with a bunch of books? And I started seeing maybe it's the opposite way that I should be looking at, like, how does psychoanalysis look from the standpoint of these longer struggles? And you can find a lot of the same problematics being argued by many people and concerning many thinkers and groups and processes throughout popular struggles in many countries. So I started getting less interested in proving to everyone that Lacan was actually the most radical person in the world. And I started being more concerned in finding out how much of the radical developments that I was seeing in many places could benefit, from psychoanalysis, and vice versa, could actually benefit psychoanalysis itself. So the group that I quoted in this recent text has nothing to do with this past history, these other collectives and so on. It's a kind of new process that has been happening now for about a year. It's called the Psychoanalysts Work Collective. And to be very simple about it, it's an attempt to unionize psychoanalysts in Brazil. It's an attempt to get analysts together to struggle for better work conditions and to fight for better work conditions, both with regards to the state. We're not a regulated practice. We have no benefits, no nothing, right? And in relation to the current institutions of psychoanalysis, which hold most of the power on how to, who gets to be, stable as an analyst and get patients and referrals and who doesn't and things like this. So it is an institution in the sense that a trade union is an institution, but it's a nascent process. But I think it's a good example of, how much things changed. Early on, I was part of a socialist party trying to teach people things about Lacan and saying this will help us with this or that. And these days, we're trying to mobilize group analysts around the country to actually use regular old political organization to get a better position for analysts in class struggle, right? So it's kind of the inverse path in a way, right? It's not really the same, I'd say. I still think that psychoanalysis has things to contribute. I'm not saying we don't or anything like this, but I do think I'm less keen on that very heroic discourse about how analysts have access to something very special about how society works, and we're always more subversive than everyone else in some degree. So I don't think that's very productive these days, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Thanks you, Gabriel. And you said notion political, many times, and I want to ask you, what is political for you in general, and what do you think about the fact that psychoanalysis is more often considered as a leftist practice, left-wing practice in its modern interpretation, Lacanian interpretation, and how does your book Desire of Psychoanalysis relate to political as an notion?
I think that's a very important point because there is I think that this was such a crucial issue early on with the reception of the book that I even added a post, kind of like a postface to the Brazilian edition when it came out, because psychoanalysts, especially from a Lacanian tradition, they generally espouse a notion that was also created in France in the 70s to 80s called the political, right? Which is capital P, the political. It's a thing, right? And I guess that guy Claude Lefort is very important in having kind of established this idea. He actually was a reader of Lacan, so it's no wonder that Lacanians like it. We influenced it, so of course it's going to be to our liking. And the political is a kind of idea about how societies are structured. It implies that there is some type of void center of power. Every time somebody tries to fill that void center, we get totalitarianism, and that the best we can have is democracy, which is how we live with this void. We accept it, and we accept differences can never be fully integrated or something like this. So this is a concept of politics that it has a very specific tradition. I'd say Claude Lefort is probably the guy, but you have like Hannah Arendt in a way was appropriated by these people. A lot of the French, Italian thinkers talk about the political as this core category and so on. And generally, everyone needs to reach the same conclusion if you start from that point of view, which is all societies have antagonisms. I think Laclau can also be put in that category. All societies have antagonisms, and the best you can do is to live with those antagonisms. And the better societies are the societies who accept more antagonism and more conflict. And the worst societies are the ones who try to do away with conflict and antagonism, and those are totalitarian ones. So you have like these two extremes. Totalitarianism and democracy, they become your guiding compass, right? And of course, Lacanians are gonna look great in this compass because we're all for difference and conflict and non-relation and, you know, whatever. So we just look good. We're always on the side of democracy, always on the side of being against totalitarianism, ultimately, right? So we're respected by social theorists, by social democrats who are sniffing totalitarianism anywhere. So if we have something to say about how bad totalitarianism is, they're gonna like us. And we have a lot to say about it, and we've been saying a lot about it for 30, 40 years. So anywhere somebody says, let's do something together in the same way, dressed in the same t-shirt, Lacanians have said totalitarians. You guys are, you know, it gives a reading, it offers a reading of Freud's theory of groups. Freud's theories of groups stops being a theory of a tendency. It becomes a political theory of good and bad organizing. Good organizing has space for desire and conflict. Bad organizing tries to homogenize, uniform, make everyone uniform, right? There's a small, very small issue with this, which is that when you try to have power, you want a lot of people to put their intensity and energy in one place. So you can pierce through something. Everyone's going to be at the same place at the same time. Everyone is going to push through a wall with the same force, right? So you need sameness to have power. It's strategized, tactical sameness. It's not totalitarian Nazi sameness. It's sameness because you want to coordinate action. But from the point of view of this theory, that's totalitarian. So if you abdicate having some ice cream to build a house together for people who lost their houses, you're abdicating desire for the sake of uniformity. That's crazy. But that follows from our theory, right? That argument has been made. So it is an interesting theory if you live in a country that, like France, cherishes having invented modern democracy and is trying to resist the coming of the barbarians with their uniformity of religion, of culture, or whatever, right? But it's not so good if you're part of a subaltern community that wants to have power to overthrow colonial forces, the power of another class, state violence, or whatever, right? So it doesn't fit well with real everyday organizing. So once I saw that some people were reading the book as, yes, let's politicize psychoanalysis, let's talk about the political, I tried to write another piece saying, wait, this is not just the only way to think about politics. Most people don't think about politics in these terms. These are very specific ways of thinking about it, because for most people, politics has more to do with self-determination and the capacity to increase autonomy for people than it has to do with just cherishing conflict and difference for the sake of conflict and difference. Capitalism, a lot of people who criticize this notion of politics have also criticized the fact that capitalism lives very well with difference and with conflict. It's therefore not an antithetical idea with capital. You can't really be an anti-capitalist if that's how you approach politics. It's not a good compass, right? So definitely the type of idea of politics that is behind the book is not this particular concept. I think it's much more of a conception that has been associated with Marxist thinking generally, which is politics is how people collectively achieve greater self-determination, not through discourse or through symbolic means, but through material conditions for that self-determination to be reproducible and sustainable, right? Now, why do I think psychoanalysis has been more left-wing in general? I think that there are two reasons for this. These days, I mean, I'm trying to think about this more these days because I've been changing my mind a lot, but I think that there are two reasons. I'm not sure they always go together. I think one of them has to do with method, and the other has to do with agency. The one is that, for example, what interests me particularly in Lacanian psychoanalysis and on it, what I think is generally something that you can find as a kind of common thread throughout psychoanalysis in general, is that it is ultimately a very small, very humble practice connected to self-determination, right? To allow people to speak and to, in some degree, say that you can't really have a manual or a recipe that tells you what a good life is, that you actually need to hear people to find out what that is for them. I think that's something that it's not invented by psychoanalysis. I think it's a very old principle. It's much more common in politics than anywhere else. But I think that it's present, with lost somewhere inside the analytic method. There is that premise there as well. And the second thing, I think that psychoanalysis has been mostly left-wing because of the feminist movement, to be honest, because it's been a woman's practice. Even though you have this big shot guys like Freud and so on, the idea that, you know, most people who got to speak in psychoanalysis were not, you know, men, and it remains slightly outside. Like if you look at the social composition of psychoanalysis, it has a slightly different profile than most kind of little practices of with this level of, you know, social power and so on. It has much more of a, it's been associated with having to listen to people who usually there is another discourse about them, I think. So I think that it's not because it is naturally leftist, but I think that it, because of something regarding its method and something regarding the very contingent connection between medical discourse, changing family structure in Europe in that time, it just positioned itself in a place where a lot of people who didn't have a discourse about themselves started participating in the production of that kind of understanding. And that, I think, makes it very hard for it to be fully appropriated by the right. But you can see that the more this has been kind of, the more these social bases of psychoanalysis changed and the method has been kind of messed with, you get easier appropriations by the right, I think. But there are really good studies, especially in Brazil. We have really good studies about right-wing appropriation of psychoanalysis. We have a very famous case of a psychoanalyst. He wasn't a psychologist. He was a psychoanalyst who aided the dictatorship in Brazil with torture. They consulted with him, and it became like this classic symptom to claim that, look, it's not that obvious that psychoanalysts are necessarily leftist. I still think that that's not I think it's like a very extreme case. You don't need to go that far, because from the standpoint of my politics, which is a bit more extremist, if you will, on the left side, I'd say most analysts I know are pretty right-wing, in the sense they're very conservative. Like they speak very leftist things about democracy, difference, and so on, but I'm not sure I should take them at their word, like, you know. So I think that it is a good debate. Why it is that it has been associated with the left so much. And I do think that social composition and kind of self-determining method are amongst key factors, I guess.
It's very interesting about right-wing psychoanalysts. I also had this experience of communicating to radical right-wing psychoanalysts, but there's not a lot of them, fortunately. So my next question will also consider as a political aspect, and your completely new concept, the desire of psychoanalysis that you introduce in your book. Fix me if I didn't get you right. That, like, the way I understood it, the desire of psychoanalysis refers to the collective institutional existence of psychoanalysis, and is also shared by an analyst and analysant, being one of the reasons for considering them as one. And it manifests as a desire to inscribe psychoanalysis into the world. So the question is, what makes this desire specifically psychoanalytic, and isn't it more an activist one? And if yes, what makes your approach structurally different from Miller's position? Because if psychoanalysis is not in itself political, so where such a political desire could come from?
Okay, no, I think that, to me, this idea of the desire of psychoanalysis, I don't think it has, I don't think it needs to have, again, nothing needs to have a political value, right? For example, baking bread doesn't need to be political, but there are situations in which baking bread is political depending on how you do it and what's happening, right? If people are telling you not to feed people and you decide to feed them, that might be political, but it's not inherent, right? I don't think anything is political in that sense. I guess this is valid for the same thing. I think it's a feature of what makes psychoanalysis effective. That's my first claim. I think that establishing conditions for free association is part of our practice. I think that these are not given, especially if you have patients who are not part of the cultural bubble where psychoanalysis exists already. If you're taking psychoanalysis somewhere else, if you have your clinic in a slightly different context where you need to adapt things or for whatever reason, I think that it's quite clear that there are some things you need to do for people to freely associate, which are not just happening by spontaneous development. And what I call desire of psychoanalysis has to do with attention to those conditions. There can be many things. And I think that in certain societies, in certain cultural situations, these things are a given. Like, if people are structured in a certain way, if their social condition is of a certain type, if they come to it expecting already some aspects of psychoanalysis to exist, that artificial space where they can say anything and listen to themselves and so on, it's already going to be there. But some things, sometimes it's not, and then you need to do things to make it happen, right? So in itself, it is kind of a non-political point. It's just a point about what aspects we need to consider when we consider the analytic practice. But just as sometimes baking bread might have a political connotation, caring for this type of condition might have a political connotation in context where one is expected simply to not worry about this and not to talk about this and not consider this as a reality. So, for example, to give you very easy examples of things that I think show this connection, which again, I don't think it's structural. I think it's contingent. I don't see many texts dealing with the fact that, for example, even though there is a lot of objects that analysts put in their offices that kind of signify that we are analysts, not sure if that's the same where you guys are, but here in Brazil, like everyone buys these kind of ethnographic, you know, like masks and items that look like the stuff that Freud had in his office, you know? They just fill their clinics with these things. But they also have class character. Like they signify that you have like money to buy certain things. That has an effect of inhibition in certain patients, because class differences can be very, very strong, to the point that you're not simply not going to say certain things to your analyst because of, you know, how far away from your reality you think they are. Like, and the inverse also happens, where I have friends who are in such complicated situation that when they have to pretend to be of a different class in their clinic, so they have things in their office that they can't afford in their lives, just so they can have an office that seems to belong to the same class as their patients. Otherwise, their patients don't want to be there, right? Is this a necessary connection between politics and clinic? No, it's totally contingent. It could not be the case, right? But it is. It just so happens that these are problems that people need to deal with. Are they profound new concepts? Do we need to deal with like a new concept of inhibition, a new concept of transference? I don't think so. Maybe they are very simple, but they are a reality. And the reason why these things are not discussed is not because psychoanalysis doesn't have the means to think through it. It's just class struggle. You can't bring these things up in your Lacanian school. You're going to be treated as somebody who doesn't know enough theory, who has problems, who doesn't know how to behave in the clinic or whatever. So what do we do about that, right? So those issues don't have to do either. The inside of transfers are not concerned with cases. It's not like you're trying to talk about a difficult case. And they're not theoretical. You're not trying to deal with, okay, but what is transference after all? They are something else, right? They're of a third type of problem. And they don't concern the analyst or the analysant. They concern the analytic setting and its conditions. So there you go. You have something that concerns neither patient nor analyst, but concerns our practice. And that is political simply for the fact that it's placed in a very invisibilized kind of situation inside Lacanian communities today, not because it has some deeper meaning. Now, I would just to address the second part of your question, I'd say that I don't characterize Jacques-Alain Miller as somebody who has an apolitical stance on psychoanalysis. On the contrary, I'd say that if you want to understand how a Maoist from the 60s decided to become Lacan's heir, you need to understand how he made the turn of saying what I'm doing is the continuation of what I was doing. Like, and to prove that this is a good hypothesis, that he thinks there's a continuation, that the most political thing you can do is to be the subversive Lacanian. Just look at how he reacted when he was called a renegade by Alain Badiou. Badiou, 10 years ago, gave an interview and said, yeah, most people in the 60s renegated communism, like Miller, for example. And Miller was so offended. But like, if you look at what he does, you wouldn't assume he would be offended. You would assume he would say, yeah, fuck this thing. Like we were so naive, we were so childish. But he didn't. He was like, I just understood it better. And I think that's how Lacan lured Miller into his position. Like if you read this text called The Life of Lacan, which is it's a kind of small biography that Miller wrote about Lacan, there is this moment where he describes Lacan telling him, you should drop the bayonets and you should come with me. So I think that what we see is not a depolitization of Lacanian institutions. I think we see an over-politicization. And the effect of that over-politicization is that analysts think they don't need to do what everyone needs to do when they want to act politically, which is collectively get together, do things together, and find out how to solve problems. They don't need to do it because they're always already political. They're already always doing it just by doing their own thing. So why do something that's beneath them, you know, and organize and learn about these things. So yeah, that I think it's different from Hilaire in that sense, you know.
Speaking of direct political statements, couldn't we say that the difference between any political theory and psychoanalysis is that in our field, the concept of goods is very problematic. Like we cannot say that we are, you know, make people happy and so on. And couldn't we say that as soon as we respond to the demand to provide an opinion, we may lose the only frame in which we can grasp the act of speech?
You know, this is a really good topic. I think that you know, generally I've tried to develop this approach of kind of situating, like, I don't think psychoanalysis needs to be criticized in the sense of, like, I think some analysts and some communities can be criticized in the sense of simply claiming that what they say is false and then looking for a more true thing behind. But psychoanalysis as a theory and a practice, I don't think it needs that much critique. I think it needs to be situated in the sense of we need to understand the context in which the things we say are true, which is not the same. So it's not false. It's just true in certain context. So that the good is a problem is true in a context. In the context where I'm in this artificial space with a patient, I'm committed, as they are to some degree, to listen to what they have to say and not assume I know what's good for them. True. And not even assume that what's good for them in the sense of what makes life worthwhile or possible is good in the sense of pleasurable. Might not be. Might be some crazy thing. Right? So in that context, that is true. Is it true in every context? Definitely no. Like, that's crazy. It's totally crazy to assume that we can trust the bad more than the good, because at least the bad is gonna give us bad, whereas the good will turn out to be also bad. So it's like a ruse. Like, that's the most cynic perspective on what people strive for politically when they're fighting for a better world, right? To assume that people who think they are going to improve society are actually trying either to tell everyone what to do or naive enough to think that there will be no problems. Like, you need to really think that hundreds of years of human struggle are just made by idiots, you know, like to think that that's what everyone thought. Like, it's not true. So I think that generalizing something that is valid for the clinic can be very dangerous in that particular regard. Like, and I think that there are very deep lessons also to learn from the fact that, well, if, you know, what is good for somebody might be something that is not good for everyone, that is also doesn't even look like a good thing because it's full of contradictions and suffering and whatever. That might teach us something. We might be more sensitive to what arrangements work for different places, people, and so on. But I find it dangerous to assume that this sort of kind of, how to call this, like this step back with regards to normativity, with regards to, you know, ideals and so on, that it is a good enough posture to take with politics. And I think that it's bad on two, or incomplete in two regards. The first is that it doesn't even explain what we do as analysts, because if you just complete the statement, right? The first part of the statement is exactly as you said. we need to be distrustful of the good. We need to suspend our judgment regarding the good. Otherwise, we can't do our work. Otherwise, we can't listen. Otherwise, analysis can't happen. But you can extend that judgment. Let's continue that statement. And the statement would continue, I am suspending the good because that's good. You are clearly implicated. It's like, I can't say what's good because that's the only way to increase the freedom of people. But clearly analysts are committed to freedom and to autonomy and to self-determination. Otherwise, they wouldn't suspend the normative good to begin with. Like, if you just have the first part of that statement, you can't explain why we do what we do. So if on the one hand, it makes sense, if we take that statement as a general one, we fall into a paradox, because then you can't account for the very practice, that happens when you suspend this commitment to capital good. So I think analysts are generally, yes, they are committed to doing something good. I don't think that they are not. I think that's a bit mischievous of us to say that. I don't think we know how to affirm that we have these underlying commitments, because they're not normative commitments internal to our practice. They're commitments to creating the conditions for that practice to happen. So it's slightly different. But once you accept that, it's easier to make connections with what happens in political practice, because, I don't know, just to give an example, autonomist Marxist practice, which is a very specific trend within Marxism, is very much committed to creating conditions for workers to decide by themselves what to do, including to decide the wrong things, right? The basic idea is better for people to make wrong decisions, but that they made, than to have somebody telling them what to do. They would be also inclined to say you should suspend the good normatively in your practice, but they wouldn't say it's because you don't care about the good, right? So I think that there is a very interesting topic, because I don't think we have the means these days to accept and recognize and talk about these underlying commitments that I think clearly we have. Otherwise, we wouldn't do what we do, And they're not that special. A lot of people have those commitments in doing whatever jobs that they do, right? I don't think you can explain like teachers in public schools in Brazil these days if you don't assume that they want to do something good, because they're paid shit. They have to take a lot of shit from everyone, and they still do it. I don't know how. Like, there's some deep commitment there to something. It's not a special thing in itself, but it's something that is good to recognize when it's there. So I think that to me, what makes psychoanalysis special as a practice has much more to do with the accumulated experience of so many people of listening to random people on very artificial conditions. Like, it's a very big, crazy social experiment that evidently is going to teach us a lot about people and about humans and about whatever. And that's amazing. But it's not because we have such a deeper insight into ethics, politics, the structure of humanity or anything. I think we know as little about those things as anything else.
Freud has a work called The Claims of Psychoanalysis to Scientific Interest. Yeah, in Deutsch it's Das Interesse an der Psychoanalyse, and it's written in 1913. And some readers of your book about desire of psychoanalysis, who are also familiar with this text of Freud, have questions. Yeah, what is the difference between Freudian interest in psychoanalysis and your desire of psychoanalysis?
Mm-hmm. I think that there are two things. There is a connection in that let's say the issue with this idea of desire of psychoanalysis, I think it can be seen in the very small scale, and then you can see it in a very large scale. In the very small scale, I think it has to do with what I already mentioned, the practical establishment of conditions for the analytic setting to be possible and for free association to be possible. That's not an interest in psychoanalysis. It has nothing to do with interest. It has nothing to do with an inclination or with a sort of recognition of its cultural value or something like that. So it's very practical, and there are practical things we do that, and I think it's both from the side of analysts, but also from the side of analysants, because to engage in analysis, in my opinion, to properly describe what that means, we would have to include both the tearing with your desire, but the choice of tearing with your desire under those conditions. So it's both to desire something and to desire to have a space to talk about them. That's also part of your desire when you're in analysis. And I'm saying that that's a relevant part of it. So that's in the micro dimension. But in the large dimension, I think that the desire for this space, both from the side of analysts and analysants, it's connected to this broader field, which is everyone, in a certain sense, can be engaged in giving more consistency to this space that the clinical settings establish. And in that sense, it does include people who have only kind of a more distant interest in psychoanalysis, right? I do think that in some level, the fact that what I investigate in my own analysis will be connected to what psychoanalysis itself is discovering about humans and human subjectivity and human psychology is relevant. So people who fight for psychoanalysis to be a legitimate practice, they contribute to that. Very indirectly. It's not the core of the idea, but you could say that they are also in the reach of this kind of common struggle, right? So in that sense, you could find a connection between these two ideas, but it's definitely not the key part of it, because it's definitely not it's not about the interest or the curiosity or the theoretical disposition to consider it as relevant that we're talking about. We're talking about something that happens in practice when we are doing clinical work as well, and specifically at that level. So to me, this is very important, because ultimately where the book wanted to get to was the claim that, the analytic community, as the community of people who uphold that certain things are listenable, certain things are significant, certain things are relevant about different speaking beings, that community is implicated in the analytic setting. And the fact that when people speak, they're speaking through their analyst to this particular kind of network, that's relevant to make an analysis to have efficacy. So the reason to define desire psychoanalysis as a relevant element of clinical work is so that we can then talk about the circuit that includes the clinic, our institutions, and so on and so forth, as a unitary circuit where all the parts are necessary for analysis to have efficacy. So yeah, I say that there is an important difference also in that regard.
A few moments ago, you said that many psychoanalysts that you know personally, they have some kind of right-wing or conservative political view, but the things they said is left things about democracy, equality, feminism, etc. And what is you said, yeah, they're something kind right thinking and conservative, and in what is they are voting for right-wing candidates in Brazil and another country, or are they conservative in their sexual life?
Maybe it's a bit exaggerated to say everyone is right-wing, but it's just to show. That's why I prefaced it by saying, from my radical leftist point of view, I think that if your left-wingness is, reduced to the fact that you vote to a center-left candidate every 4 years, that's not that much, I mean, so I think that as a first point, like that, to all these discourse, I think I'd say that if we want to assign political kind of orientation based on the practice, I'd say first, most people are neither left nor right. They're just kind of generally conservative, in the sense that they're not engaged in much. But even in the case that people have a more leftist discourse, I think that just the mismatch between how radical the discourse is, and what they actually do is enough to give it a strange hue, a strange vibe. Because, most people, I'd say most Lacanians that I know of, most psychoanalysts that I know of, do say a lot about democracy, about openness, and so on. But a lot of liberals say that as well. They're for democracy. They don't want fascists. So I just think it's a very low standard to assign leftist ideals to people. But they're there most of the time, I'd say. But I just saw Elena's electricity was cut, right?
So let's hope the intrusion of the political real will not happen this time.
But if it does, we can just schedule a third meeting. Don't worry.
Yeah, we'll try to do something. Though it's a good occasion to ask you a following question. In your article dedicated to the past, which I previously mentioned, you say, wait, I will quote, at those points where analysants treat a social regularity as mere singular occurrence, our work might be to open the space for social structures to be recognized and for analysants to listen to themselves as traversed by challenges of a different order. So probably someone who reads this fragment can suspect that analysts might have a risk to shift from a supposed to know position to the position of the one who knows, like knows whether a particular problem can be passed through or withdrawn from the analytical clinical process in order to be solved somewhere else. Like if you were talking about two kinds of real. So do you have any examples how it could be technically done so that this shifting wouldn't happen?
I think that to answer that question, I think that there is one thing that we need to have clarity over first, and it connects to the question with that idea that I mentioned last time, that I don't think we need that much critique of psychoanalysis, but we need to situate a lot of things. So subject supposed to know. What does it refer to? Does it refer to any knowledge? Are analysts do they not know anything? Clearly they know a lot of things, like they know to be quiet, they know how to sit in a chair, they know how to open a door. That's not a supposition. We do know those things and we show people that we know them, right? So there is a specific knowledge in the operation of the subject supposed to know. The subject supposed to know the desire of the patient. It's not subject supposed to know anything about the world. Like, for example, if the lights go off in the middle of a session, and you know why they went off, and the patient pretends like they are ignorant about it, even though you both know what it is, you might be able to read into that ignorance as it being significant, because you're reading it against the background of something that both of you know, right? That's relevant, that you can separate those two things. And I think that that's where the distinction between politics and I guess other fields comes into play, because politics is about common things, right? It's about shared things amongst people, equality and so on. So political knowledge generally points towards common underlying things. Those things are not the same as the supposed knowledge of the patient's desire. So I think that, again, situating what we mean by subject supposed to know and what is the supposition that we're not there to confirm as analysts within transference is very important to delimit that a bit more, because otherwise it might make it seem that things that are going on in this analytic setting and that envelop that setting and challenge that setting in many ways, you're allowed to pretend like you don't know them, because transference prevents you from, confirming the supposition of knowledge that the patient puts on you. Like, there's a distinction on that. So the point about this idea is that I think that one way to approach this, though I don't think maybe it's just a initial version. I think that there are probably better ways to discuss this than the one in the text. But I think it's very relevant to shift our focus from the terms to the relation. What I mean, for example, if something is meant to always be regular, like what we mean by repetition, for example, in speech, something that is always meant to be regular. People always speak in the same way, and one day they speak with the wrong word. They use a different word. That's significant for us, right? Let's say people say, I opened the door from the cab, and one day they say something else. I opened the door from the scab. That's a variation that's significant. And it's significant because things were meant to be regular and they were not. Now take the inverse. Things that are meant to not be regular. I had many different relationships and I described them all with the same words. So, one day my mother told me, one day I hurt my mother because I'm an idiot. And then 10 years later, I hurt my friend because I'm an idiot. Then my lover because I'm an idiot. It's meant to vary, but it's not varying. That's also significant. So the idea of the signifier is not connected either to singularity or regularity. It's connected to the relation between the two, where it was meant to be one way and it's the other, right? It's meant to be regular and appears as irregular, or it's meant to be irregular and appears as regular. That's the type of thing we're listening to. So you need to be able to listen to these variations. One way to detach these variations and make them appear is to be able to tell apart regularities that are not coming from the subject speech. They're not unconscious regularities or irregularities. They're coming from elsewhere. So, for example, I've used this example many times because I think it's a very useful one. I have a friend who used to go see his analyst, and she's a white famous analyst in Rio. He's a black guy. He used to be frisked by the doorman before he went up to her office. Like, no one else would be frisked and checked to see if they could enter the building. And the guy would call his analyst every time. This guy's here. Can he go up? And she would say, sure, he can go up. But then another patient would arrive and he wouldn't say anything. The other patient would go straight up. So she was only getting calls for her black patient to see if he could go up. Is this fact something that concerns the singularity of that patient or concerns the regularity of racism? Like, can I, when I act as if I don't know that difference, is that preserving the subject supposed to know as something that is not being kind of, so the transference can be opened? Or am I being a dick? Am I being a racist? Am I at least being complicit with it? Those things are different. We can't tell them apart. And it's very likely that it's hindering free association, which is what he told me. Like, I can't say anything to somebody who doesn't know how to listen to what the doorman calling them means. If they don't know what the doorman calling them means, they won't know how to listen to what I say. They won't be raised to the point of a subject supposed to know. See my point? Like, if you're a racist analyst, you are not going to be a subject supposed to know to certain people, because they won't suppose that you can interpret certain things. They will either not say them, or they won't listen to themselves telling you those things, right? So my point here there would be, first, knowing the difference between the things you know and the things that the idea of the subject supposed to know refers to, which is something that you really don't know, which is the subject's desire. We're not pretending we don't. We really don't, right? It's important. Second, the idea of what's significant in speech has a very strong relationship with what's regular or singular, but not with one or the other, but with the shift between the two, right? So, for example, if I do know what the doorman only calling my black patient up and saying, can he come up? If I know what that means, and my patient never says anything about that, that becomes significant. So I can hear more things. Why? Because I am assuming a regularity of racist profiling, and their silence about it becomes meaningful, right? So it adds to analytic listening. It doesn't bring you to some other field where you're suddenly assuming you know everything about the patient and introducing countertransference. Like, those things you can distinguish them, and I think that we need to have a clearer sense of the limits of the idea of the subject supposed to know, and the ethics of suspending, countertransference and a suggestion about the meaning of things. We need to have a clear sense of where that ethics applies, because it can be the source of the very unethical behavior, where you can just tell everyone and tell yourself that, I'm not allowed to intervene or to care or be concerned about certain things, because after all, my position is of pure neutrality, And I remember, like, I don't know, maybe a year ago, because of the work I've done in Lebanon and so on, I started receiving newsletters from one of the Lacanian schools in Beirut. And they're very much like Brazilian Lacanian schools. They love the French, right? And I had just had a meeting with a couple of friends, and the meeting had been interrupted because Israel was bombing Lebanon, bombing Beirut. I could hear the jets. And the newsletter arrived, and they were hosting a seminar that day about feminine enjoyment and Lacan Seminar 17. And there was no mention at all about the situation. Like, there is a level of denial, which is crazy. That's denial. That's not neutrality, and we need to have means to make that difference, I think. So that part of the text is an attempt to put things to treat the concepts in such a way that we can at least make that differentiation.
In Lacanian psychoanalysis, as well as in some lectures by Michel Foucault, there is a term orthopedics, which is first appears as a metaphor in Freud works, and Lacan brings it to a signifier that is used in a negative sense in relation to psychologists, positivist, and many other representatives of positivist and cognitive psychological science. What do you think about the use of this term nowadays? And it seems you don't use it in your writings.
To me, this is complicated because I think that Lacan was fighting a very specific battle, and I think the battle is very important, and the means to fight the battle are also very important, because the battle was about what is the core of psychoanalytic experience, and the sort of institutions and ways of organizing this experience that were available at the time. I mean, I think that I always found very interesting the very short remark that he makes. I think it's on the seminar on identification somewhere, that he says, you know, maybe it's not that because they favored ego psychology that the IPA and other analytic institutions became so centralized and hierarchical. It's because they decided that to preserve Freud's legacy, they had to be centralized and hierarchical, that they came up with a model of the mind and of consciousness that mimics that. Because ego psychology is about defense, preservation, building strength, and so on and so forth, right? So that model, one way of thinking is that it was born as a scientific idea. The other is thinking that it was born as a sort of organizational attempt to preserve psychology and show it to be a strong discipline capable of defending itself. And then that created an idea for the clinic. I like that idea. And it suggests that you don't fight necessarily those ideas by simply making theoretical arguments. But so I think that that was very much his time. This was, let's say, a more normative approach to psychology, concerned with fixing people or giving them the right way to do things and so on. And on the other hand, he was living in a period, I mean, he was already quite old after the war, the Second World War, but we associate his most creative period with the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? And the 50s, 60s, and 70s were a moment where philosophy and critical thinking in Europe took a very anti-normative turn. Every normativity is fascist, right? Personally, I think it's because the French were collaborationists in the Second World War, and that traumatized them. So fascism is everywhere, you know, so they are always looking for who is the fascist. And well, they are the ones. So they don't want to talk about that. So my impression is that if you combine those two things, that enemy and those tools, you end up having this idea that psychoanalysis has no normativity. And we should always be striving for this sort of very mystical, singular relation. Every type of attempt to ameliorate suffering is a cop-out of the actual analytic experience, which is not concerned with suffering at all. It's concerned with something much deeper and so on. I think that that's an exaggerated and not necessarily good way to deal with explaining what we are doing. And I think that there is also an issue, because two issues kind of prevent me from dealing with these problems of good and bad practice in terms of orthopeutics versus the subject's desire, you know, as an opposition. First is that because of this idea of desire of psychoanalysis involving both patients and analysts in some way, it implies a level of common ground or practices that analysts do to keep that common ground there that often involve caring for suffering, often involve diminishing anxiety to the point that analysis can happen. You know, like my experience and the experience of a lot of my analyst friends is that medication is good when it helps analysis to move along. Like if you're drowning in panic and anguish, you're not gonna do analysis at all, you know? So there is sometimes practices that help us establish this minimal situation in which analysis can happen. And it's very different. Patients who take, I don't know, all sorts of psychiatric drugs in order to avoid doing analysis, and those who take them so that they can do analysis. How do you call that second case? What are they doing? It's a practice to make analysis possible. We need to be able to recognize that difference. So I think that's important. Second, I mean, if you don't recognize certain types of suffering, you don't allow the analytic setting to be established. For example, the example I just gave you about the racial profiling, recognizing that that's a shitty situation your patient goes through with the doorman that you pay for, it's not like, if you can't recognize that suffering as relevant for the setting, you're not going to allow the setting even to exist, right? Not to speak of many, many situations where analysis clearly gets interrupted. And that happens to so many analysts, where you just know you're shifting away from being an analyst to just being somebody there while people are suffering beyond what they can, you know, turn into elaboration or working through. They're not going to do anything with it. You just need to be there. So there is a lot of practices where clearly paying attention to suffering is very relevant to allow analysis to happen. So that already puts us closer to what would be the orthopedic side, which I don't think it's true. But if we divide the world between people who want to shut up desire and give you a recipe and people who care for desire, if that's the division, this type of practice doesn't have a place. The second issue is that the more you try to bring work into the picture and describe analysts in their practices as people who are doing some work, work does imply regularity. So you need to be able to talk about some normative dimension of what we do. And it's not orthopeutics. Not everyone who does something with regularity, with a bit of knowledge, with attention, in a repeated fashion, is trying to do this, have the same results, right? But it does imply that you need to bring the question of normativity again, not at the level of how we intervene, how we interpret. Those things clearly don't have a manual, but there are other things we do that you can teach other people. You can talk about them. We can do similarly, differently, and there is a whole level of structure to our practices and work. So because of these two issues, the issue of suffering and the issue of work, I'm not sure if that way of dividing the question between orthopeutics versus the partisans of desire is so useful. That doesn't mean to say that it's not the same battle in some degree, because there are definitely bad uses of psychoanalysis. But in my opinion, today, at least in some parts of the world, often the bad use also includes the partisans of desire at any cost. The analyst I just mentioned, who I consider to be a racist analyst, she would see herself as a partisan of keeping the openness of desire. Well, it's up to the patient to tell me if something went wrong. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to be here. And while she says these things, she acts in kind of crappy ways, right? That get in the way of analysis. It's orthopeutics in another sense. It's racist orthopeutics. So it's that distinction might not apply everywhere so neatly, you know, as it did in that historical situation, I think.
You know, I want to ask you a connected question because you said very important thing to a question I want to address to you. Some of my friends saying that they comparing that cases of Freud and his associates that they were willing to work with. Yeah, what kind of symptoms they the most diverse forms of neurosis, psychosis, schizophrenia, hysteria, and other signifiers of symptom. Yeah, and with modern situation, yeah, when Lacanian psychoanalysts are willing to work, and one gets the impression that many analysts, Lacanian analysts, are afraid to take on something extraordinary. Yeah, and in the form of it's some kind of joke. Yeah, it's in form of bourgeois neurotic. Yeah, isn't the modern Lacanian psychoanalyst a dream? Yeah, a dream of peace. And where do you think the boundary between psychoanalysis and, for example, psychiatry lies now in terms of people's symptoms?
Yeah, that's a really good question because, yeah, but I think that there are many different levels to this, because I think that there is, let's say, the canonical distinction where Freudian analysis is more centered on neuroses. Lacan would have contributed to not only expanding the reach of psychoanalysis to consider psychosis more seriously, but reconsidering our neurosis also from the standpoint of what we learned from psychosis. At that level, I think that there's already a nice kind of critique, perhaps one could make. I'm not sure if I agree with it, but I think it's a fair critique to consider, which is that there is a difference between Lacan having been able to really expand the reach of the clinic to psychosis versus having learned things from psychosis for the clinic of neurosis, but that remains the focus, right? So that might, I'm not sure if I agree with that fully, because I know many analysts whose clinic is mostly centered on psychosis and psychotic patients. There's definitely a big change in how do you assess, let's say, the circuit of these analyses more generally, because they're often analyses without end. They end for contingent reasons. They're often analyses that don't connect with either theory or the analytic community, because you don't see psychotics becoming analysts amongst Lacanians. And these are not usually the cases that, give rise to new ideas for psychoanalysis. Usually are the fringe cases where, is the autistic subject, is the, ordinary psychosis, but it's always slightly closer to neurosis, the things that then make people rethink categories. But still, I think it's undeniable that Lacanian psychoanalysis has helped both analysts and other doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, and other professionals who work mostly with psychotic patients. It clearly has something to bring to the table. But I think that there is a critique where you could make the case that it is precisely this blind spot, that claiming to have a stronger relation to psychosis, but not really having a clinic for psychosis, that opened the space for, Guattari and Deligny and those guys who really wanted to have a clinical setting centered on psychosis, and this led to totally different clinical settings and so on. I don't know where I stand in this issue. I think that that's a very interesting issue, and frankly, I don't know enough about the actual practice of, schizoanalysis. I know from the theory, but if I don't trust Lacanian theory, why would I trust schizoanalytic theory? So I don't know enough to wage on that much. But I think that what you say about Lacanians being afraid to take on extraordinary cases, I think that that's a very varied situation. I definitely identify some situations I could say it's that case. I remember when I was starting to see to have patience. I had a patient who claimed his hand was not his hand. Somebody had just put his hand and stitched it to his arm. And I was so anguished, like I couldn't handle it. I just referred him to someone else. I said, okay, I'm not ready for this. I can't deal with this. Like, good luck. and I, in a way or another, I referred him to someone else. So I definitely know I also have the fear of God in me. But I think that it's a slightly different distinction, because, you know, it's if you accept the premise that when you're seeing a patient, listening to someone, you're not alone there, because what the analytic community is able to sustain as existing, as relevant, as listenable, affects your own clinical listening, affects what can happen to a patient, and so on. If you accept that hypothesis, then there are cases where the fragmentation, isolation, tension in the analytic community will affect the anxiety of analysts. And it's very different to need your patients to confirm to you that you are an analyst, and to be able to be challenged by patients because you're not sure what you're doing, but that's fine. You're not going to be kicked off from the group just because you have no idea of what's happening. So I think that this issue of fear, which I think it's very relevant, and I honestly don't see it discussed anywhere. I think it would be very hard to get a public conversation about analysts' anxiety and fear of certain patients. But I think it would ultimately lead back to a discussion, not about the theory or the practice as such, but about the organizational communitarian background of a community. Because depending on the degree of tension in that community, you have less space to risk. And the anxiety that patients cause in us, I think it's mostly appeased, mostly subdued because of the analytic community. Frankly, I think, okay, this might be too polemical, but I think like 80% of people in psychoanalysis seminars are not there to learn. They're there to be less anguished so that they can keep on with their practice. That's what I would do. I used to do when I went to seminars and so on. I was really hoping to go back home feeling a bit more like I'm not a fraud, and that there are other people who speak the same language as me, evaluate situations in similar ways, which means I'm not crazy. Because if you're alone seeing patients and you never speak with anyone else, don't read theory, you just go off your gut, it's really, really, really anxiety inducing, because it's a very crazy thing that we do. So I think that fear, I would connect it to that dimension as well, you know? As for the third part of your question regarding the boundaries, I also don't have a strong position on that, because frankly, and this is something I've been developing in the supervision group that I've maintained for the last couple of years. You know, early on, people would bring cases and I would quickly worry about if what is the psychic structure, the subjective structure at stake here. And then I realized first that that's not a question I ask myself very often in the clinic. I often ask this question when I'm anxious, like when I feel I need to know more than what the patient is telling me. Like I need a model for action. Like this person is psychotic, therefore I will already know this and this and this about them, right? Rather than just going with whatever they're saying. And then that started happening in supervision. I started trying to avoid trying to know what the hell I was dealing with, or what the analysts were bringing as their cases, and trying to come up with our own names for the structures we were seeing for each case. So, you know, preferring like, you know, Freud's case names rather than structures. So like started naming people like the chicken man, and the case about the repeating something, you know, like detective stories rather than Agatha Christie novels, rather than psychic structure. And that was very helpful, because things can be more mixed up in terms of if it's in our turf to care for, or if it belongs to another field, because then you can get a feel for the things that move along, the things that don't move, they're always there and you can't touch them. You can deal more kind of in a more singular way with patients' kind of expectations about, you know, taking medicine or taking some type of prescription drug or something like this, and you can assess the effects of it and not really have like a over general kind of ethical idea of what they should do, you know. That has been helpful, but I feel like I'm still learning a lot about this to have a opinion. Like I'm kind of lost at that issue. Generally, but I think that as a kind of heuristic or heuristic, no, but as a provisory moral, I assume that nothing is in our field. I like to think like this, like everything could be sorted out better through something else, which is also the reason why most people try other things before they come to us. Marry someone else, get a better job, you know, find God, do some political work, paint, get drugs. I don't know, maybe all those things are better. Since you're not doing those things, you're talking to me. So let's see what we can do. I think that's a better approach than like, this is something you can only deal with here. And those are other things. Like, how can you tell that? Like, I don't know, you know? And I think that also refers to something I didn't hear anyone talk about this with regards to the book. Maybe it's not so clear in the book, but I'm not convinced psychoanalysis has anything to do with the psyche. You know, like I'm not sure that's our concern. And I think that's good reason why. To go back to your previous question about orthopeutics, I think it was there is this Mexican analyst. And there was a time in the past, I think he made this claim. I'm not sure if he went back to it, but it's called a guy called David Pavón Cuellar. He's a really good analyst. And he wrote a book where his argument was that psychoanalysis is against psychology, not in the sense of a discipline, but in the sense of the existence of a logic of the psyche, logos for the psyche, in the sense that that's why we have a meta-psychology. We have a theory of how people create psychologies. So we have a theory of how people invent that they have a psyche, that is a mental space that is consistent. So if that's the thing that we're listening to, how people invent this, that means that they don't have it. Like it's not a natural structural thing. So like maybe we don't have anything to do with that realm. And I think that's the last realm we think we have something to do with. Like that's our house. Maybe it's not our house. No, I'm ready for neuroscience to tell me that they figured it all out, and then I don't think I'll be out of a job. I think I'll just have a slightly different job.
I'd like to jump back to institutional topic. I don't know if you have a chance to read Alexander Smolyansky's afterwords to your book. I don't know if it's translated. Yeah. Cool. So he views your thought of aнализантс as excluded from institutional process from another perspective, saying that aнализантс, especially didactic ones, are actually already included because they are already in transference on psychoanalysis, and they are very much concerned about what's going on in the institution. And this has a very practical aspect. Aнализантс being in a position that we can call extrinsic may notice something that an analyst steadily belonging to the institution sometimes has no chance to see. And probably we could say that analysts who don't want to take those things in consideration turn out to be excluded even more than they think their aнализантс are, because of they're not willing to know. Mm-hmm. So it looks like it's a kind of different approach to the same topic. So what would you say about that?
I remember when we had a conversation about this, I felt like it was much more of a complementary approach. I don't think you need to choose between the two. I think they're just focusing on different things. I totally agree actually. I think that my claim was more like, maybe it was too much based on my own experience and the experience of people I know, that a lot of analytic institutions, when we are, for example, when you read a book by Zizek or by philosophers who talk about psychoanalysis, everyone is an analysant, in the sense that they almost sound like speculative self-help about how to deal with existence and sexual relation and so on, and tearing with the non-being inside of us all, or something like that. So everyone is tearing with this problem. So everyone is more on the side of the subject with these questions. In analytic schools, the culture is not addressing people as analysants. There is no way inside analytic schools of talking to people and addressing them as if they are on that position. I've never seen, at least, a seminar where that's how people are addressed. Even if they are analysants in practice, and 99% are, which in that sense, definitely they are included for sure, but they're not talking and behaving as analysants. They're talking and behaving as if they are analysts, commenting on other people's analysis, you know? So my point was more about under which guise are analysants allowed to participate in an analytic experience in these communities and seminars and so on. I remember one time when I was starting to do my training, which, let me open my parentheses, I've never finished. Like, I have absolutely no official reason to justify being an analyst. Like, even my analytic training, I dropped before it ended. But I remember when I started doing it, I didn't have any patience, because I thought I had to finish it before I would see patients. So what was the only patient that I knew of? Myself. So I would raise my hand during some presentation and say, look, I don't see any patients, but I know this one neurotic guy that I followed in the clinic, which is me. And I remember this moment in analysis where this happened, and it seems to have to do with what you guys are saying. And it was always so embarrassing, because it's not meant to be like that, in part for good reason, because what can they tell me back that won't sound like they're interpreting me, right? But ultimately, everyone is in that position to some degree, even people who have patients and who are there, because they also are crazy people and they're there in that institution. I think, for example, psychology courses are much more honest about this. Like in universities, early undergraduate semesters, clearly everyone is crazy and is just trying to find themselves in the books, you know, as one would. Probably a lot of people just entered so they could find out, have cheap self-help, you know. So my point was more about, well, why are we constituted as interlocutors in these different positions? When you're reading critical work based on psychoanalysis, we are convoked, we are brought into the picture as interlocutors, as if we're all analysants. And when we are in the institutions, we're brought up as if we're all analysts. But in practice, I think what Smulian's saying makes total sense. That's how it is. Analysants are included. And what's more, the fact that we are analysants, and the fact that there are transferences, the fact that there are a lot of questions that are never addressed, the fact that there is a difference between actually being actually participating as an analyst and pretending you're there as an analyst, all those things, I think, highlight a lot of dynamics inside these spaces, you know, which make for, I think, his main point, that there are a lot of things that people who are constantly having to transition between these positions will be able to see, that people who are steadily and fixed in the position of, I'm an analyst, this is my group, and it's all good and well, they will probably either not know or not want to know about. So for me, the two things go very well together. And I think generally that's a good position, a good kind of point, that usually people who need to change roles, they learn more about the spaces they're in than people who can always stay in the same role. which is the reason why white European or European-looking males tend to be idiots, because you can be that in every place. You don't need to, be a foreigner, then be part of something, then behave in one way, then behave in another. When you need to shift codes, you need to learn something about the codes. When the codes are made all for you, you think you know everything all the time and you're not seeing anything, right? So I think that still applies in this case as well.
One more question about the book. In chapter 8, you propose two variations of the path. One already practiced in a new Lacanian school confirms existing psychoanalytic knowledge with new material, and the other one will be intended to problematize existing knowledge by introducing a new idea. So this second one operates at the generic level, which means entailing changes in both theory and clinical practice, for example, by creating a different way of listening. And it seems that you expect the emergence of an institution capable of desiring a change in its own foundations. How is this possible? Are there any preconditions for such a desire in the existing institution, or they will be somehow created from scratch in a reformed institution? And could you locate such a place for such a desire and such a group structure in Freud's schema from mass psychology?
Okay, that last part is more complicated, but the first part, I think that the answer is actually very boring, because I don't think I'm proposing something that doesn't exist. I think it already exists. I do think that you can't explain a lot of what has happened to analytic schools and knowledge and in the last 100 years, 150 years without this. This has happened already many times. I think that, it is the problem. It is one of the problems that I think people who deal with, are interested in political history, not in the sense of political theory, but the history of movements and things. We're always concerned with this: transformation and reproduction. Those are not two choices. Those two things happen at once. You need to transform, but whatever is transforming needs to exist and it needs to reproduce itself. And then there is this very tense balance between how much you're willing to risk to transform and how much you need to conserve in order to remain in that process. And many, many times you can describe failure as ultimately kind of conceding completely the transformation for the sake of reproduction. That's what we call, for example, bureaucratization, right? An organization develops such strong hierarchical tools to reproduce itself, to become strong, that it can no longer be renewed or serve transformational purposes. That's this reproduction gaining over transformation, right? But those are not separate things. They come together. And they're even more complex because often transformation is desiring a new type of reproduction, like social reproduction. It's more fair, less dependent on the sexual division of labor or race. So you're still wanting the reproduction of something, some structure to continue. So it's a very complex relation between these two things. And I think that when you are interested in this and then you look at psychoanalysis, you can see that, well, we've always had to deal with the two things. Creating something, a practice, a body of knowledge, a way of creating some minimal criteria for what does it mean to belong to the community of analysts, what does it mean to become a psychoanalyst, so on. So you create minimal ways to preserve this practice, but that practice is very much connected to learning new things. And Freud changed his mind many times and corrected himself many, many times. And many, many analysts do that on an individual level, a regional level, and on a broader collective sense where we realize some things we were saying are no longer, we can't really take them as true anymore, and suddenly things change. I think this has happened with many aspects of subjectivity. Probably the focus, the main one, has had to do with sexuality, gender, and a lot of things. I mean, these changes have happened. But when you try to see the circuits through which these novelties have been adopted, it doesn't coincide with the structure of our institutions. It happens almost behind the back of institutions. So to give you an example, I remember like 10 years ago, this Brazilian analyst did their pass. And as it was the case, I'm not sure if it is these days with the institution he was part of, I was part of the same institution back then, he had to send the report of his end of analysis to France because it's an international school. In France, they read it and they concluded that it couldn't be what he was saying because he remembered a scene from his past where his granddad had cut the head of a chicken in a ritual, which is pretty common in Brazil, especially if you have Black ancestors. They said his granddad must have been psychotic and that this was not duly noted in the case, that there was still an identification, imaginary, hiding over that way of talking about that past. And they asked him to change. And the official pass that circulated didn't include any of this. But I know about it. How do I know about it? Because analysts talk, right? And that really changed my mind. I said, holy shit, I don't know anything. I thought, I shouldn't have questions about where psychosis and religion are related. And clearly somebody can be an amazing analyst, listen to a lot of people. I've seen him. The material about his past was very interesting, but it contained a new idea that didn't match my own conception. And it changed how I listen to patients. But that circuit is not the institutional circuit, because at the institutional level, they told him to cut it off and not to cut the head of the chicken again and not have it there, right? So this happens all the time. Like, I would never have written this in the book if I thought I was like trying to kind of tell the people what to do. Like, who am I? I don't know anything. Like, I'm trying to formalize something that I think we already do. And I think that this already happens. But curiously, I think it happens in spaces which are not the ones that are responsible for the reproduction of psychoanalysis. Because for some reason, we have reached a point where the transformation and the reproduction of psychoanalysis, they feel like they're in tension and they're not one leading the other forward. I don't think I put this in the book because it's just too vain. But one of the things that led me to write this book is that there is a book by a guy called by Badью, this famous French philosopher, and it's called Theory of the Subject. And in Theory of the Subject, he makes this remark, says, well, Lacan liked to say that Freud is like Marx, and Lacan himself was like Lenin. And then Badью, who already didn't like Miller, says, Miller is like Stalin, but we don't know who the Mao Zedong of psychoanalysis will be. But, the Maoist process was a process where within the victory of the Communist Party, they decided, with all sorts of contradictions, to destabilize the communist victory itself for the sake of transformation, right? That's the Cultural Revolution in a way. And I do think that this problem has to do with the issue of revolution in psychoanalysis. It really does have to do with, clearly there is a lot of people interested in the capacity for transformation of psychoanalysis. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. You guys are on the other side of the world. Like, what are we doing here? You guys are, I'm crazy, you're crazy. Like, what's going on, right? But this has nothing to do with the organization of the field we belong. so that tension is not a tension between what is and what should be in the future. It's a tension between two things that already exist. I do think that these things are a bit aligned with class and a bit aligned with power, but not only with that. They're also aligned with theoretical deficit. We don't know how to reincorporate things into psychoanalysis until, I don't know, the feminist movement comes knocking on the door and says, have you read what you guys said about homosexuality on this paper? Is this what you guys standing for? And then we're like, no, right? Like somebody needs to come. But that's not the best way to do it. We listen to people all the time. We have all the means to change these things anyway, right? So I don't think that idea is, first of all, it's about proposing a new thing. I think it's just about giving tools to recognize something that already happens. The chapter doesn't do a good job in saying this. It should have that said on top of the chapter. It would have been much better. Second, I also think that the chapter is not clear on a second point, which is this process, it doesn't happen at the end of analysis. It happens all the time through analysis. Like people share parts of their analysis that change other analysts' minds all throughout the shared process of exchanging information about what we do. It's not like this idealized endpoint and then everything is different. So I think that not only is this generally more invisible because of the bureaucratization, if you will, of psychoanalysis, this ossification of the reproduction structures, but also because it doesn't have this ideal path that we could all look at the end of analysis to say, well, this is this beautiful symbolic moment of the past. Let's learn something from it. It's scattered throughout a lot of analysis. And I think that the biggest proof that this is true is that no analysts are waiting until the end of analysis to start clinical practice. You learn enough to listen to people differently very early on. And then you listen a bit more and you change a bit more. So this is much more scattered, right? What I do think could be a new thing, and I think that it's not going to happen anytime soon because analysts are very bad at politics. They were the shittiest professional category I've ever seen. Like we're really bad at organizing. We know very little about it. But what I do think that could be interesting to do is to find out how do you foster this in a way that the cost of this type of interaction is smaller. It's not going to risk your career to talk about it. It's going to have a more credible stance amongst us. It's going to be treated theoretically more seriously. We can organize to make that happen. But ultimately, there is no bureaucratic structure that can erase this type of more generic aspect of the past, because that's why I say it's the idea of the past is ultimately the idea of psychoanalysis, because listening to things and then that changing how you listen to things, that's what we do there. What else do we do? We don't do much more than that. So like you can't erase that and still have psychoanalysis. So it's going to be there in formal or informal ways. You know, we could do better, but it's not like we need some Brazilian guy to tell us, you know, what to do. I think I hope that's not what the book is proposing. It's less than that. It's more humble.
Miller is for sure not Stalin. It's very funny how Zizek complains that he is not a master enough, so we cannot take a real hysteric position just because he is not a master enough. And we all know these analysts from New Lacanian school who are told that they have no right to open their school or publish their book, otherwise they will be kicked out from the school. And they're like, go fuck yourself and open their school and publish their book. And they're still there in the New Lacanian school. Like even in Russia, we have these guys.
Yeah.
So there is one more question also about the thought that you raise in a book. Like you point out the essential for psychoanalysis idea that our setting is artificial, a kind of laboratory where a completely new type of speech is being created. And it definitely doesn't mean only that this subject of speech is located just inside the setting, but eventually at the end of analysis, we get a new subject as a result of a kind of new type of castration produced by an analyst. So my question is, can we say that a type of this new subject is slightly different in various branches of Lacanian practice? And do you think if your project will institutionally succeed, that some new features of this theoretical practice with a new ideological aspect and other styles of listening would create a subject with completely new features that would be probably more complex than the one produced by analysis nowadays?
So yeah, I do think that that's actually a very interesting question. It's a complicated one because I think you need to, like, for this question to make sense, you really need to accept the premise that psychoanalysis participates more on the production of subjectivity than I think often we assume. So, I mean, there's definitely a sense in which whatever happens to people who come to analysis is beyond our control, and that's a good thing. And I think that there's also good theoretical reasons to deal with, to name and deal with this sort of different dimensions that they bring as a matter of subjectivity. And so to use the term subject to refer to something that is beyond the scope or beyond the reach of what we produce in analysis. But I do think that there's also, we can miss important aspects of our practice when we don't realize that there is active engagement of the patients on whatever happens in analysis, and that engagement shapes them in many ways, and that is something that other authors like Foucault and so on would call the production of subjectivity. So I do think that that's a very important premise to consider before answering that question. And then what I do think that, like, I've been thinking a lot about this because, you know, in this process of meeting a lot of analysts to talk about work conditions and what we can do together to improve them and so on, like things that, just to give you an example, like a lot of analysts in Brazil don't make any money for like 2-3 years because they start their clinics, they don't have many patients, and they need to rent space. They can't see patients in their houses because they live very poor places. So they rent a space that looks more socially acceptable, or that will look like a medical office or whatever. And we started discussing, like, okay, but why not let patients, if you have a space in your house where you could see patients, why not save that money and have patients over? A lot of analysts who have more money, they do that. You go to their house to have your session. And the point was, well, but they will see things. They will see how I live or where I live, and that will be a problem. And it not only was there a lot of other ideological aspects to this, like why is one case okay and the other case is not okay? Why is the class status, a bourgeois class status, something that looks like neutrality, but your class status looks like it has a lot of markers that are significant? But besides those ideological issues, there was a deeper ideological issue, I think, if I ever write another book on psychoanalysis, which I'm not sure I can, but if I could, probably would be about this, which is the degree to which we assume this very paradoxical position where analysants are subjects, but we have this deep responsibility over what we do, that they are not agents with us in that. to the point that I can, for example, I think the fantasy that most analysts have when they start their clinics, which is that they can lead their patients to suicide, which I think is a very debatable thesis, if that's true. And, you know, I read once this, I think it was Jean-Claude Milner who said this, and it always stuck with me. I'm not sure if it's a good idea, but I think there is some truth to it, which is that analysis either doesn't do anything or it does good, but it can't really do bad. Like, you can take people money and that's bad. You can, you know, do nothing sometimes in urgent situations is bad, but it's not the same as doing creating a negative effect, right? It's almost like analysis negative effects come from its lack of effectivity. Because when it is effective, since it doesn't really carry any content to the analysant, it's generally an interesting effect. So either it does have effects or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, that's where the bad effects come from, so to speak. But what does this mean? It's not that it's inefficient or ineffective, like when we make a crappy interpretation. You know, like I've done so many of these where patients are speaking and then I think to generally it would come with, this is such a good intervention. And then I would say something and they would like, yeah, okay. And then they continue speaking, like, shut the fuck up, right? Like, what is that? That is a manifestation of the fact that people are not idiots. People think. And I think that we have a very hard time accepting that patients think. That like between your intervention and its consequences, there is a thought. That is not the analyst's thought, and it's not some mechanical thing. It's not conscious thought as well, because thought is not necessarily equated with consciousness, but it is something. And I think that a lot of transformations in psychoanalysis these days, those that have to do with social situations and social conditions of analysis, but also those that have to do with other aspects, I think they all will kind of go through that impasse. Do you assume that your patients think or not? Because if under the assumption that they don't, the risk of trying new things is just too high. Don't try anything new. You can fuck everyone's life. Under the assumption that they think, you can try some things. If they work, they work. If they don't, they will tell you, yeah, shut the fuck up and let me continue. You know? And I think that the idea that analysants think helps to lower the risk for new analysts. And when it lowers the risk for a new analyst to experiment, to try having patience and to listen to people, it also lowers the power of people who have monopoly over formations and training and, you know, seminars and so on, because you don't need them so much. That doesn't mean that there is no specific thing we do and that you can't be a shitty analyst. You can, definitely. But I have the impression 99% of analysts learn through practice. They didn't learn because somebody taught them exactly how to do it. So you learn because you tried things, and the bad things, people told you, yeah, I don't want to come back here, and they leave you, or it just doesn't do anything, and you continue, and you learn through that, in that weird partnership. So I think that if there is one thing I'd imagine that could have a very deep effect on the type of subjectivity that psychoanalysis produces, is a greater commitment to that. I think it's very different to produce subjectivity under the assumption that analysants don't think rather than they think, or vice versa, right? So I don't think that like new theories or things like this are going to matter that much to change anything in this regard. I think it has a lot to do with shifting the balance of what experiments are okay to try out. I think that like analysants who go to your private clinic for years and years and years, and they always speak about the same things, and you're always presenting in your same way, and they see that that's how other analysts present, and that's just what it is. I think they will help you uphold psychoanalysis as an existing thing in a very meager, simple way. If they see that you're struggling, you're trying things out, you live in a world that maybe is not their world, and they need to cope and deal with it as well, like the analysts I was talking about who have to see patients in their houses, but their houses are not that well off. I think that has a chance of changing a bit how the subjectivity is produced in psychoanalysis. That's where that could come from, in my opinion, you know? Yeah.
The next question will be connected also to your community and institutional experience. Your critical analysis is aimed primarily at the ideology of Miller School, since it represents the contemporary psychoanalytic institution par excellence. However, I'd like to ask whether you have encountered any local examples of the ideology of communities that follow Lacan in some other way, or do they share the same view to some degree? And also, what do you think about communities that try to avoid the institutional dimension as much as possible, such as Vapiro School?
Yeah, I must say, I think that this is, you know, I made a kind of rhetorical choice in the book to focus on Miller, because I think everyone loves to hate him. And so those who love him love to hate him in a different way, but everyone kind of agree. It's funny because I was at a event for a small Lacanian school here in Brazil promoting the book, and they are like the most anti-Millerian. But the funny thing is that every paper quoted Miller as having distorted, changed, misread Lacan in some way, which made it look like he's the most powerful and probably the only original post-Lacanian thinker. So if you love him, you think he explains everything, that he's the closest to Lacan. If you hate him, he's still a reference to most. So I chose to focus on some key passages on him because I think it would allow me to make the argument better. But the book is not really addressed to him. I don't think that any of the critiques of the book are particularly addressed to him. Most of them are addressed to Lacan himself. And I think that I chose Miller because I think that he made clear attempts at certain operations, interpretations early on, right? That's why I almost don't mention any of his new texts or anything like this. I don't really care about those things. I don't know what to do with them. And I mean, so I'd say that I don't see much of what's written there that is different in other institutions and so on. Like, of course, there are many things that are just interesting experiments. People are trying new things. But in principle, I don't think that because they're anti-Miller or not interested in him, that the ideas developed in the book wouldn't apply. And I've definitely seen a lot of groups that position themselves, at least on paper, as being against him. For example, the Lacanian, the Forum of Lacanian Schools, I forgot how you say this internationally, the Colette Soler kind of branch, which was born out of a tension with Miller. But to me, they're kind of the similar thing. You know, in our very rough and vulgar correlation, like they would be it's like the Trotsky other side, you know, like we don't want your oneness of hierarchy, we want to have plurality and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but you guys are kind of part of the same period. You're not like totally something else. And then though Trotsky had so many interesting things, Trotskyists in Latin America, they are so annoying and barely distinguishable, you know, from whatever they're criticizing. So I think the same thing applies. Like, so no, I wouldn't say that like it's that restrictive, or that, you know, that the interest or disinterest or antagonism with Miller kind of shapes who fits and doesn't fit in that critical thing. I do think that the thing that does make a bigger difference is whether spaces are, I think it's two aspects. Like I see having an influence on groups, collectives, and institutions ultimately being slightly different or highly different. One is the level of attachment to Lacan himself and how they deal with that. I think that's very telling, because often they are against Miller, but they are very eager to produce their own master interpreter of everything, and you know, whoever can preserve Lacan as this central figure who is not like a really bright fellow developer of psychoanalysis is like the beacon of everything. That's one. So the relation to Lacan, I think, is a big issue. And it is very hard to find spaces where Lacan is a really crucial kind of part of the theorists you're using to think psychoanalysis, but not necessarily, you know, the sole guiding force. Lacanian schools are usually schools about Lacan. And second, I think that there's also the institutional form, which is if you are concerned with giving legitimacy to analysts, preserving the theory, and kind of lowering the anxiety of practicing analysts, if you're trying today to have these three tasks in your institution, generally you end up doing what everyone does, offering seminars that are meant to be about theory, but ultimately are helping people feel like they belong. And then you're trying to come up with a criteria for analysts to feel like they belong to that institution. They don't. I feel like the problem is deeper than just, you know, if you like or dislike this commentator. So I think that even very very different kind of cliques or groups inside of psychoanalysis end up having the same structure, and those who don't ultimately don't have the tools to do any of these three things. They're not preserving the theory, they're not training analysts, or they're not kind of you know, it's usually like people who want to study together, people who want to have a chance to debate the theoretical side, or collectives like the one I'm part of, which are dealing with work conditions, not necessarily with, you know, other aspects of the institution. So I think we're in a moment where most institutions end up looking very similar, even if they are very kind of conflictual amongst them. And the other things that are happening, they simply have other functions. So you don't get to see institutions with very different functions. At least I haven't had the experience so far. But that's part, I think it's because it's a historical problem. It's not because people have bad intent. It's really hard to solve. It's not easy.
Yeah, this is very important thought that you give in your book, that you don't divide Lacan and Lacanists. So now we cannot say that, okay, there is fucked up Miller and almost saint Lacan.
Yeah.
No, Miller is very good Lacanist. We have to deal with it somehow.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I also think that there is a problem with that's why I disagree. I think that I disagree with your maybe I'm willing to be convinced, but I do think that, like, I hate Zizek's argument about, well, it should be a better master, like not master. I think that's the cheapest kind of way out, because real masters are like that. They're not that good. They're just, that's what being a master is. That's how it goes. Like, and I do think that one hysterical and especially obsessive to, I mean, Zizek's clearly the most obsessive guy around. A very common obsessive thing is to say, you're not upholding the law as well as you could. I want an even worse torturer, you know? That's just in fantasy. That's how you maintain your distance from it. And it helps you to kind of not really consider the, like, the fact that I feel Miller had to deal with some challenges that most analysts and kind of coordinators and organizers of psychoanalysis don't have to deal with. It's very complicated to bring psychoanalysis to many different countries, try to simplify things to the point that you can share it. Lacan didn't do that, you know, and a lot of people, they just came after that was done. So to criticize Miller is also to take seriously all the things he tried to solve, you know, and then you need to show that the solutions are bad solutions, but the problems are real. You can't throw away the problems with the bad solutions, you know, and I feel like that's also part of where the analogy with the more Stalinist side, I think it's worth it, because they're also the ideal Stalin and also the real, you know, version of it. And there's also the fact that there are some tasks that most communist movements have never ever had to deal with, and what are those problems? I think we're still unearthing what those problems are, because whatever we try again will include those problems. So you need to be able to separate terrible solutions from the problems that they were trying to deal with, because we're gonna have to deal with them again. But I feel that regardless of him, it is very hard, and I constantly was scared of this with the book. Like, it's very hard to criticize Lacan and not being totally arrogant, vain guy. Like, who am I, you know, to say, oh, but maybe Lacan was wrong, and not be like, because there were books that are criticizing Lacan, and like Absolute Master that Michael's board, I forget his name. There were a couple of books like that, and there's a whole tradition of, you know, people who just treat him as a charlatan, or people who treat him personally as a bad guy or something like this. But I find it very hard to try to claim that there's a limit to this huge, massive theoretical and practical endeavor. The only reason why I felt that I was entitled to try this is because I didn't feel like they were my ideas. I feel like I'm looking out of the window to the street. Like, this is how people practice psychoanalysis. This is what is written. It's a struggle between these two things. It's not a struggle between my head and a genius. I wouldn't try that. I'm not an idiot. But, you know, like, more as an intermediary of that other thing, I think it's okay to, it's a fair position to take. But I was very kind of scared of it, because I think it's very hard to find a good justification to criticize something that it's obviously also so fruitful, so important to so many people and myself.
And we are not sure if you are familiar with us in this feeling, but it's quite noticeable in psychoanalytic discourse of Eastern Europe. There is a quasi-ideological division, into firstly, supporters of psychoanalysis practically as a poetic art, and conditionally, these are people who are supporters of Lacan, and at the same time, they share many of Heidegger's theses about language, speech, and poetry in one way or another. And these peoples are very skeptical of attempts of to formalize psychoanalysis, including with instruments like topology. And their thesaurus dictionary about techniques of psychoanalysis. And secondly, it's a party of mathematicians, supporters of strict mathematical and logical formalization, and supporters and followers of Vapero, psychoanalysis and its topology, and etc. And how noticeable is this separation in your intellectual psychoanalytic context? It's first. And second, what do you think about this separation at all? Is this an urgent problem that may call into question to the foundations of psychoanalysis, to the institution of psychoanalysis, yeah? And do you think psychoanalysis is an institution in general has distinguished traits?
That's, I mean, I'd love to know. I didn't know that this was the case. It's funny because I think that, like, I don't know much about the history to give you guys a good account, but from what I know, in Brazil, we had a sort of initial debate that looked more like this. Like in the 70s, the first seminars of Lacan translated to Portuguese were translated by a plastic artist, like a sculptor, who then founded his own Lacanian school. He's considered to be like this guru, crazy fellow. Nobody talks about him anymore. He died recently, in fact. A very eccentric guy, but he came from the art world, and he clearly privileged the more kind of poetry / language kind of side of it. And this was in the 70s, 80s. And by the 90s, we had a field of people who were more connected to some degree with Miller, but not necessarily. They were very much connected to the epistemology school in France. So they really cared about the connection between psychoanalysis and science as the core point. I think that there's also a connection that the more art-based people were happy to be outside of university, and they really kind of criticized the absorption of psychoanalysis by university, whereas the more science-based people, they were teaching courses at university, they were philosophers, they were interested in the sciences somehow, also to validate why their university positions weren't antithetical to psychoanalysis, I think. The 2000s led to a big shift. Like when I started reading psychoanalysis, all the journals I had and so on, they were of one of these two sides, like crazy existential poetry, read Lacan with this poet, blah, 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 or why epistemology, science, and psychoanalysis, like Poiré, blah, 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 and all these things. Like, I think it's different. Vapereau is something else. Like, from what I'm saying, from what you're understanding from what you're saying, this duality is much deeper in the case that you're describing. It doesn't sound like it's just what's the preferred partner. It feels, because Vapereau's relation to topology mathematics is deeper in some sense. But we had that something like that duality. But the social crisis in the country was such, I think, that's my interpretation, that first, university spaces are not spaces of science in the humanities. They're spaces of politics. And the private space of these artists, analysts, also was starting to feel the problems of being so detached from social reality. So one way or another, suddenly a sort of agreement that psychoanalysis had to deal with social questions started to emerge from both sides. And it leads to the moment where we have now, where psychoanalysis and social studies and political movements, this is like the core theme for a lot of what's produced. You know, on the more conservative side, it will be psychoanalysis and drug addiction, psychoanalysis and, you know, minors who are criminals and why, and so on. And the more progressive side will be like Black feminism and psychoanalysis and so on. But I think it took the core, it took the center stage, and fringe groups now want to focus on these other things, and psychoanalysis and science, psychoanalysis and art, for example. So we have a slight different. We've lived through something that sounds a bit like what you're saying, but it moved to this other thing. But even at that time, I don't think it was like, it's like, you know, people love epistemology. They don't like mathematics. Like they like to talk about the sciences. They don't want to do science. It's very different, right? So we don't have a serious tradition in Brazil of dealing with that topological mathematical side. Though the best book I've read on the topic was written by a Brazilian, a guy called Paulo Marcos Rona. He wrote a doctorate thesis on category theory and set theory and the logic of signifier, which I think is absolutely brilliant. And I think it's much better than what the Argentinians have done, like Edelstein and other guys like that, who have like tens of books about Lacan and mathematics, Lacan and topology, and so on. I do personally care for like Vapero's work, that other guy, I forgot the name, who wrote like Lieu de Sujet. It's one of these French names I don't know how to pronounce. La Vendôme, Liedom. I don't know how it's called. Like I've read a lot of those things, and I do think that they're very interesting. I've lost track of what Vapero has done in the last 10, 15 years. I'm not even sure if he's alive, whatever, but what I used to like about it today is the type of thing that I dislike. And which is, I rarely feel like mathematics, like the reason why psychoanalysis should be interested in other fields, in my opinion, is that, you know, when you model your propositions in terms of another system, what you ultimately want is that things that you can't reach inside your own language, you might be able to reach on another language. So for example, a good use of topology, in my opinion, would be to say something like Lacan's proposition: the passive and the active sides of accounts in analysis sometimes change, and you start as a subject and you end up as the object of a description. Then you make a claim about a modeling structure. That sounds like a non-orientable surface. That sounds like a Mobius strip. You're on the one side and suddenly you are at the other. Something like that. Okay, but mathematics says a lot of things about Mobius strip. Mathematics, the least important thing about the Mobius strip is that it is a strip. It has many properties for Jordan curve theorems, for all sorts of theorems, and you can derive those properties inside of mathematics and topology. And then you want to be able to ask the question, how I translate this consequence back to psychoanalysis? If you only go outside of your field to show that, like to borrow the authority of the other, this thing is like a Mobius strip. And then I ask, okay, but what else is a Mobius strip? And you tell me 10 facts about it, and none of them are relevant. I'm actually borrowing the power of mathematics. I'm not borrowing mathematics. So the only reason to do this is if you're interested in the statements that mathematics can produce in its own field, that you can then translate back to your field and ask, okay, but what then might this mean here then, right? And there are very, 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 very few propositions from these fields that get to be translated back. And I felt like this was very often very mixed. And the best authors, which were usually practicing mathematicians who knew what they were talking about, they would go further in this. But ultimately, the practice that they were talking about was very similar to everyone's practice, and we didn't feel like we were learning new things so much. So that was always a concern. But my impression is that none of the processes we were talking about in terms of absorbing new things, listening to new things in psychoanalysis and so on, can really go that far without enriching our conceptual language. And the easiest way to enrich our conceptual language is to model it through other languages and then do this process of translating and then translating back, you know, in the most rigorous way you can do, with the most kind of attentive aspect possible. So I do think that it is very fruitful. I think that I can see the, like, if I were to organize these things in my head these days, I feel like mathematics tends to be employed in the sciences and even in fields which are not scientific per se, but generally for the fact that it captures things that are preserved once you transform, right? If you change context, you change situations, some things remain the same. Mathematics is very good to speak about what remains the same as things change. Whereas art is really crappy at that. Like, that's not a really good use of art, to try to generalize things, right? But I have the impression that probably we shouldn't have to opt between the two things, because when I'm like in supervision talking to other analysts and we're trying to invent situations, like hypothetical case situations where, just to exemplify things, clearly we're doing a bit of fiction, we use jokes, we use examples from books, from films. That's good material to kind of pretend like a singular situation is happening, right? Whereas I think mathematics is not there for this. Like, it wouldn't make no sense to try to calculate an interpretation. So I think that you shouldn't have to choose, because probably mathematics can enrich psychoanalysis language when it comes to talking about large-scale structure. And I think art is usually, poetics is good when you need to kind of come up with artificial singular situations to just think what it means to intervene without a recipe, you know? But it doesn't make sense to choose between the two for the theory as such in general, because psychoanalysis is neither art nor mathematics. So why would you have to do that? But yeah, I'm very interested in this because, you know, this idea I was telling you guys before, that I think that we should probably start treating the idea of signifiers as units of significance that are relational with regards to regular backdrops in a regular surface or irregular backdrop in a regular event. That's a different way of formalizing this. And there are very, very interesting tools in mathematics to do that we could use. And if I had 3 days more in my week, or if the days were like 10 hours longer, I would probably spend some time researching that, but I can't. And I'm just too dumb as well. That I wouldn't go very far. But I'm very interested in that too.
Yeah, a time management problem.
Yeah, it's a small problem of the finitude of humans. Yes.
Yeah. And return to political questions. If we talk about desire from the point of view of political vocabulary, for example, about general will, or the will of the multitude, and what do you think a psychoanalytic institution can give to other institutions, for example, political ones, in terms of the question of their political desires or requirements?
That's a complicated question, man, because I don't know. I don't know if desire is a very important category for politics. I think that, like, it's no wonder you use two terms, right? Will and desire. And analysts hate will because it's so cheap and ridiculous. But I mean, I know a lot of desiring people who do no politics, because political will is so hard to maintain, you know. And I think that there is this guy called Peter Hallward. He's working on this idea of recuperating what do we mean by will in politics, because it got trapped between two discourses. It got trapped between the critique of voluntarism that Marxism and other traditions have, of saying, yeah, doing things based on the will, it's always going to be spontaneous, it's going to be short-lived, it's romantic, it's not considering class character. Revolutionary subjects are not the people who want a revolution, or people who need it, or are in position to achieve it, and so on. And on the other side, the second psychoanalytic discourse, where will is conscious, intentional, kind of cheesy, right? And desire is this deep, excessive, radical thing. But in my political life, I feel like will is the hardest thing to find, not desire. And then, of course, we need to define what we mean by desire. But I think that it has to do with the fact that, like, strong interruptive power things that rupture, things that kind of put identity at bay, like you think you are something and then you do something that betrays that, right? That experience of interruption, betrayal of identity, they are very core for psychoanalysis. And I think again, if we move, because I think we could apply this to, we can redefine signifiers in that relational sense. I think we can redefine desire in the same way. I think desire is very much a measure of the degree to which you can sustain going away from some identification criteria you have and still recover yourself on the other side somehow. But so those interruptions there and ruptural moments, they're very relevant for desire and for psychoanalysis more generally, but they're not that important for politics. Like, I think that I think it's such a retroactive interpretation of political life to claim that revolutions are interruptions. I think that's like the way it looks to people who are not involved in things, like, because it's not like it's a punctual, like, how long does it take to do something revolutionary? It takes like years. It's not like you wake up, you've done it. It's not an interruption. It only looks like an interruption if you were going about your daily life and then something got in the way. So it has a reactionary, conservative smell to discuss revolutionary action as a matter of interruption, to me. Even if you do have that feeling that something is different and this is not regular life, this is something else. Yeah, but this is not regular life means it's another life, means it's another continuity. Doesn't mean it's an interruption of regular life. It's almost condescending. And of course, if you put it in terms of interruption, then you're going to ask, what's going to happen next? Have you guys thought about what's going to happen next? Right? Everyone is an idealist who has no sense of consequence. But any political practice, in my opinion, is about continuity. Like, even if you want to fight the police, well, you only win if you are continuous. If you throw a rock only once, that's stupidity. If many people throw many rocks for a consistent period of time, that's more intelligent, right? So again, continuity. So political will has to do with continuity. It has nothing to do with interruption. And it doesn't matter if you're desiring or not desiring. Political processes mix people with fantasies about what they're doing, with people with clear intent, with people who are just passing around and just in it for the fun of it. What counts is the collective will that keeps that thing going. Which makes it very hard for analysts to think about politics, because they know how to associate desire subjectivity to interruption, inconsistency, paradox. But the hard thing to do in politics is to show up every day. You're in bad humor, you do it. You're in good humor, you do it. You're happy, you're sad. You don't like the people you're with, and you do it anyway, right? Which also leads to a disruption of identity, because no social identity is meant to keep on going forever. So it's also excessive. It's also asocial, like the drives or whatever, but not in any way that psychoanalysis has any notion of how to do it. So I think that the best thing analysts can help with is that we know that there is more than identity to people. Good. But how identity freedom gets deployed in such different fields as the clinical setting and actual collective action, I don't think analysts know anything about it. And I can tell you this firsthand because organizing with analysts is terrible. like this process we're doing in Brazil, nobody knows how to do it because nobody's used to showing up, all the time for a cause. They feel it's cheap. Like there must be something else, a libidinal investment. There is no enough. Like nobody has enough libidinal investment in a communist revolution. Like that's not a lost object because your mother treated you this or that way. Like there is no libidinal investment in justice. If you might think you do, but that's just your personal head. So like what you need to do to be constant and continuous That's why people criticize voluntarism. Not because it has too much will, but it doesn't have enough. And if you really had enough will, you would be looking for material means to keep on going. And that's why you need the working class, and that's why you need, you know, to consider who needs it, who needs to be leading it, and so on. So I feel like that makes it very hard. I don't think that necessarily Rousseau and like general will and those things are the best way to think about it, but I've been rethinking a lot. Like I as a Lacanian, I've always spoke shit about this, you know, like clearly desire, this is what we need. But I wonder if that's the case. Maybe the book should have been called The Will of Psychoanalysis, but you know, I'm not sure. But I do think that there is something worth thinking about that has to do with this particular distinction, that politics continuity is the really dangerous thing. Like it's not the interruption, I think.
Yeah, it's very funny. It will be a book like Nietzsche and Will to Power and Will to Psychoanalysis.
It's a pity that Nietzsche's idea of will was so crappy, you know, but yeah.
The will to analyze, yeah.
The will to analyze, yeah, that would be good. Yeah.
Yeah. And in your book, Desire of Psychoanalysis, you problematize the current economical practice that makes the didactic analysis for analysants from poor backgrounds unacceptable. And what do you think consider the experience of representatives of the specific group particularly available for the development of psychoanalytic knowledge?
Yeah, I just wanted to join the question and ask, you speak a lot about these analysants from the poor backgrounds with low income that cannot become analysts, cannot become a didactic analysants, but there is a really widespread practice in which a lot of analysts do this. They let analysant set the price by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But it looks like it's not enough. Like it's not enough for letting people from these backgrounds to become analysts.
There are a couple of issues there. The first is I think that it's the good, I mean, not the good, but the important thing about focusing on the more extreme cases is that I think it highlights how there are more features than just the price. I think the price issue, for example, in Brazil, people complain a lot about both the price of analysis, the price of training to become an analyst, things like this, the issue with kind of establishing yourself as an analyst. You know, we have famous public intellectuals in Brazil who are analysts, and they love to speak like, they refer often to the idea that analysis should never be your main job. You should have always two jobs, you know, which is ironic because most people in Brazil have two jobs anyway. But also that he doesn't just mean that. He means you should make money of something else and then be an analyst, which is like such a luxury that you could be well off and stable enough to do this. So, but anyway, there is this issue directly connected to price. But when you see what happens in more extreme cases, you can see that this is not just what it is. For example, training spaces, length of analyses, the culture of psychoanalysis, all these things put other costs and other obstacles in the way that are not just, you know, as if you solve the price issue, everything would be solved. Recently, there was a series of cases where, you know, Lacanian schools trying to fix the problem created like scholarships to Black students, trans students. Yeah, but then you're the only Black guy or Black woman in a room full of white people talking as if whatever it is you go through doesn't even exist. Why would you want to be there? And then they didn't. They just left. And then the school said, see, this was not a problem. We did our share, our part, and they didn't want to stay. Like, it's because the desire is lacking, and go back to that problem. People are not doing it because they don't desire it. So this is why I think Marxists don't focus on price. They focus on value, because price is things expressed in terms of money, but value is a social relation that is much broader, and it can be in action, even in places where things don't have price. So it can be shaping culture, shaping labor, shaping all sorts of things, right? So that's one aspect of it. I think that when you think about what's available for people in certain situations, the limitations of psychoanalysis as a kind of apparatus that is meant to absorb or potentially absorb people and train people and bring them in, it becomes clear what those limitations are. Some limitations, I think, are borderline structural. We don't see that many psychotic patients ever becoming analysts, even though I hope there are more than we know, because it's very likely that some people are psychotic, we simply don't care that they are. But that's definitely something. That's not written anywhere. Why that's not the case? I've never seen anyone talk about it. But there are other limitations as well. In Brazil, ratio-wise, that go very against the grain of statistics, considering the population in the country. It's very weird that we only have white analysts. Usually you have these very strange disparities between the interest in certain types of cases. Like, I love when this happens with social diagnosis. Like, everyone now is trapped in the capitalist, consumerist, whatever. But then no analysts are. It's just their patients. Like, there is no analyst who says, and I am also having to deal with this. It's like something that happens to other people, right? So all these disparities, I think they're relevant. And they are not all explainable in terms of price, right? Or just access in that sense. So access, and I think that's something Smolensky also spoke of, about access as a much broader problem or a different type of issue. And I think that that's definitely relevant. But I also think that there is a totally separate problem that also comes into play here, which is if analyses include a place for people in the sense of, and it goes more directly to the point of this idea that there is some desire of psychoanalysis, which is part of clinical practice, because it's not just giving people access to this space, to train, to think as analysts, to listen to new people themselves, to participate, but also if psychoanalysis appears as something that needs participation, because that also is something that hinders people from ever wanting to be on the other side. So I feel like this is a very core problem as well. I think that the freshness of psychoanalysis is very much connected to that transformation side of the transformation reproduction dyad we were talking about. And when that transformation or their implication in transformation is not felt in any way in the clinician, in the setting, in the place of psychoanalysis in culture, I think psychoanalysis loses effectivity in general. I really do. I'm not sure if I can have a good enough theory of this, but I think that the ambiguity about whether it is a charlatan practice or something new is part of what makes it work. It's something that Freud talks about in that anemic, psychic or anemic treatment. It's a very old text, I think 1895. So this unknown aspect, it has some weird analytic effectivity for interpretation in general. And then I think that unknown is also part of the reason why people might want to become analysts. So even if you do have access to analysis, and even if you could become an analyst, I think that we're always going to have a harder time interesting people who feel like psychoanalysis is fully on the side of they know what they're doing, you know? So that's also a different type of limitation that I think also it's hard to change it without dealing with these other more material aspects like money, power, and so on, but it's not reducible to it. It has more to do with that capacity to keep transformation alive somehow, or an option somehow. But that's something that I've really found to be true. It's one of the things that I'm most curious about psychoanalysis. And I think that it relates back to that idea that people think. I think it's somehow related to that too, that, you know, you only need to give off this feel that we know what we're doing. You come here, it'll be treated by us. Everything is kind of out in the open because we feel like it's such an asymmetric relation. If it is something like, let's see where it goes, I can listen to you, we'll see what happens. It's more egalitarian, but it's also, it has more unknowns, I think.
Well, I guess we can ask the last question and let you go finally, because it looks like we can talk to you forever, especially when you talk and we just listen. The last question will be like a half comic one, and also will relate to the concept of the desire of psychoanalysis. We can remember Lacan's formula that the desire of the subject is the desire of the big other. So could we, in this context, take the psychoanalysis as the big other that has to be barred one day?
I think that's a really good. You say it's half comic, but I think that's a really important issue. In fact, because I wrote this last text trying to address this a bit better, because I feel like what we have these days inside of psychoanalysis is a kind of you have three types of otherness, right? You have imaginary otherness, then you have the big other in the symbolic realm, and then you have the barred big other in the level of the symbolic and the real somehow. But I feel like this is actually, I'm sorry, there is probably a funnier answer. This is like a really nerdy answer. But I feel like the reason why we can only think of otherness in those terms is because we think about the other of speech. But our practice is not really defined by the other of speech. I think it's defined by otherness in terms of listening. And the imaginary other is very much connected to being heard by one person, right? The one who you're talking to. The symbolic other has something to be, some connection to the conditions of being listened to in a unrestrained way. Like, what can you say that makes sense, or that is even grammatically correct, or it's appropriate to a context, right? But how do we name the fact that if you tell people who care about psychoanalysis that you, I don't know, to use like one of Freud's examples, that you get horny because of the oilness of somebody's nose, okay? Like, and they will say, oh yeah, cool. Like, you can't say that to anyone. It only makes sense for people engaged with some things. It doesn't make sense for people not engaged with it. How do you name that type of otherness? That's like a type of code of shared commitment that makes something significant, whereas in most contexts, it would either be insignificant or would signify something that you have no control over. You're just a perv guy, right? So that's the otherness that's connected to desire of psychoanalysis, right? Is the idea that there are practices that maintain a certain circuit where a lot about human sexuality, love relations, weird stuff is treated as if it has a proper form. It's not a formless or meaningless thing, right? It's not a symbolic network that is fully integrated into social norms, cultures, theory. It's not just the general other, and it's not the imaginary other of the analyst you're talking to. It's some sort of common backdrop that doesn't cover everything, and it kind of only covers as much as there is a commitment to the fact that something like the unconscious exists. I don't know how else to, like, I don't think we can do without that. That thing exists. We keep that alive, right? That's part of what makes our practice effective. And I think it's a really good way of describing the process of analysis, where it's, for a long time, you rely on your analyst to keep that type of otherness as the backdrop of what you're saying. At some point, you don't. At some point, not only do you do that by yourself, but with others and for others. And if you can do that for others, you're an analyst. Which is funny, but not in the comic sense that you were talking about. And I think that from that point of view, it's much harder, like the battle today. I think that's why the most annoying thing to me, and I'm very sad about it, because I used to love it. Like, which Lacanians, Hegelians, whatever, don't like to talk about the real and like read every paper about the real and have like 10-hour conversations with friends about this. But these days I find it the most embarrassing concept that we have, because first, I think no field should have, like, the real is such a huge word. Like, it's not a good name for something specific. It's too broad. But it's also thought of in a way that is very, very hard to split and create nuance and create structure and divide into further concepts. It's almost like the end of conversations, not the starter of new ideas. And I feel like that division we're talking about between something like the broad conditions for speech to acquire shareable form, which would be something like the big other, and this restricted, committed-based type of otherness that everyone involved in psychoanalysis maintains, it's hard to advance in that direction because of the way we use the concept of the real. Because it would imply that we can split the real into different types of real. There's the real of the symbolic that is an impediment to the symbolic, but there is other types of structures that have a different relation to this. More things have space in it and so on.
Well, that's fair enough.
Fair enough.
Thank you a lot, Gabriel. That was an amazing conversation and a great honor to talk to you.
No, it was my pleasure, guys.